We were staked out overnight in a big RV, and we had to have protection with us. And the guy who was our protection officer was an ex-Vietnam vet who sat there with a submachine gun, taking out the magazine, clipping it, cocking the machine, unclipping it. It was madness.
Hi, my name's Davey Wright. Welcome to Paths in the Outdoors. Today I've travelled up to just outside Inverness to talk to Duncan McCallum. He is a climber, TV presenter and the CEO of the Ledge Climbing Gym, a new climbing gym that will open soon in Inverness. So hi Duncan, welcome.
Welcome. Thanks very much for this opportunity.
No, not at all. No, we have been in touch about different things in the past, and and I thought we'd take this opportunity to come up and chat and have a beer, obviously, and just to hear your story and obviously talk about the Ledge. But we'll get to that because I think that's a kind of current project.
It is, yeah.
I think what would be good to hear is just a bit of an intro to yourself and where and how you got into the outdoors.
Wow. Well, I started climbing. I was introduced to climbing by a gym teacher at Dingwall Academy. So I was born and brought up here. And at 16, when I thought, I'm out of here, I never want to come back to this place ever again. Absolutely didn't want to. And at that time, that would have been in the mid to late 70s. And there was nothing happening at all. There was no climbing walls. There was very few people up here who were outdoors active. Apart from a few, and one of those who really, I served a very traditional kind of climber's apprenticeship, one that you'd have seen in the 60s, really. So I was introduced to the hill walking for all sorts of complicated reasons. So I'm quite severely dyslexic, but came from a kind of, I suppose it was a kind of middle class family, lower working, middle classy kind of, definitely wasn't working class, but not enough money to send me off to private school. But being dyslexic, I was neither with the kids who were playing football or playing shinty, although I did play shinty a lot, but then wasn't kind of bright enough to be a kid that belonged to somebody who was a professional. My dad was a livestock auctioneer. And the one piece of advice, the only piece of advice he gave me as a career's advice was never go into agriculture so all my extended family are all farmers and auctioneers. But he said never go into that because he could see the writing on the wall with the way that industry was going. So it's kind of like, okay, so I'm academically not gifted because I can't write very well and reading was really tough. But then I knew I didn't want to be a labourer or a road maker or whatever. So I was kind of stuck in this odd place between two camps. And I suppose at school had a few friends, but I was kind of not really in one tribe or another. So I didn't quite fit in until some people I liked went away to go to Morvich Outdoor Centre. And at that time, it was, I think, Highland Council, or it had been Ross and Cromarty Council at that time, had this outdoor school near Dorney. And it was an absolute revelation to go hill walking, sea kayaking, and then the first time we went climbing was with a guy called Ian Rowe, who wrote one of the very first Highland Outcrops guidebooks. And I think there was 12 of us out on that 2-week outdoor adventure thing. And we all went top roping on a sea cliff near Kyle. And I was better than anybody else. And I thought, right, this is for me. Something I'm good at, because I'm quite competitive. I suppose nowadays I'm much more competitive with myself than I was with others. I thought, oh, this is something I can really hang my hat on. And that was it, 2 weeks climbing at school and then nothing.
So how old were you at this point?
I was 11 when I first went hill walking and 13 when I first went rock climbing.
Okay, so you got it pretty early.
Pretty early.
And how? I mean, obviously these days, having a learning disability, as it says. I hope I'm not tagging that wrong.
No, it's exactly what it is.
How was that? Was it identified at school, or how was it managed at school?
No, it wasn't. No, and I think that was that set me off in this path of being a filmmaker and a professional climber, or somebody who likes developing something in climbing. So I knew that I loved the outdoors and I liked nature. So I thought, right, okay, the options are I drive around farms selling cattle feed or I become a forester. So I applied to Aberdeen University to do forestry and I got 1C at higher level. That was it. And that was in geography because I really like geography. And that was in 5th year at school. And then an English teacher said, I don't understand this because you're really quite good at your classwork, because I would spend ages doing it. And I was reasonably bright, so I could understand, I know my eskers and my drumlins and my raised beaches and all of those things. I was really enthusiastic about that and I can retain information. But then expressing that in some sort of written form, it just didn't happen. And then have that, which when you're under pressure and a dyslexic, you just draw blanks everywhere. And he kind of analysed my handwriting, and I would start a sentence with the same word that I'd finished the other one. So there was all sorts of weird things, and mixing up colours like orange and yellow I still mix up. Pears and peaches, oddly. B's and D's and P's and Q's are all a big sort of mess. So, which is odd because my job now is filling in grant applications, which involves writing thousands of words. And he thought, well, there's something odd. And he had just heard, this was in 1978 or 79, he'd just heard about this thing called dyslexia, which was being analysed in mainstream education. And he thought, oh, I think you're dyslexic. And I went, great, that explains everything.
You'd be able to give it a label or
yeah,
an identity for that issue.
Yeah, I'm kind of, nowadays when my job with what I'm going to be doing next will be very much working with people with quite identifiable physical and mental health issues. Having a label is often not that helpful sometimes because it sometimes gives people an excuse to stick with something, and then it's very hard to take people out of that. If you're stigmatized or you're self-stigmatized in a thing, it often gives you an excuse. But man, I did have an excuse. But then in my 6th year at school, I didn't do anything academic at all. And I did a load of sport. I went climbing every weekend and I did lots of art. And at the end of that, I had a portfolio. I applied to go to Napier to do a degree in photography and got halfway through the process. And the interviewer said, look, you need a stronger portfolio than this with a bit more photography, because mine was all sort of drawing and painting. And he said, go away, do a foundation course in fine art or photography, and then see where you are in a couple of years. And that was the plan. And then I got chucked out of the house. My mum just said, you're not hanging around here drawing.
Taking pictures.
Go somewhere and get a job. And she found a job for me in Tyso's in Edinburgh. My sister was at Edinburgh University. She's very academic. And I stayed with them, found a flat in Edinburgh, a whole education going down there from the Highlands. Man, right at the start of the kind of, it was like big drugs. The first flat I moved into in Edinburgh was a total culture shock. It was pretty mad.
bit of train spotting vibes. So.
Yeah, but kind of like lots of drugs and lots of weirdness, and that was in direct conflict with my outdoor stuff. But before that, I think at the age of 16, I went to the Alps for the first time. So when I was still at school, I used to work in the auction mart and save every penny I had. Got to the summer, and my first summer, I got on a Eurostar ticket, went to London, got on the train to Chamonix and went to Chamonix. Because that was what you did. You learnt your kind of climbing craft in the Highlands or in the mountains, and then every book you ever read was you crag to become a better alpine climber. So if you wanted to be a mountaineer, it was all about going to the Alps.
And did you have a mentor for that, or was it a case of just going and finding other people to climb with?
Yeah, two really formative people in my early climbing days. One was Ian Daly. So Ian was a farm manager from up here. I think he's in Aberdeen now. And Ian, when I first started climbing, had just come back from Baffin Island. He'd done some routes in Asgard, did one of the Scott routes in Asgard. And he was a proper mountaineer. So we did I think, one of the triple buttresses on Ben A in the middle of November in a snowstorm with almost no light. And I was like, I think I was 14 or 15 when I did that. And it was, these days, it would have been a winter ascent. But the fact it had snow in it, we were still rock climbing, brushing the snow off. It was an absolutely, and I remember climbing over the fuselage of the crashed bomber, or it was an inspection, I think it was an early warning plane that sits at the top of fuselage galley, and it was completely covered in snow, and we were belaying off the cockpit. Got down in the dark and all that kind of stuff.
Good Scottish one to
proper stuff. Yeah, absolutely. And then, but Ian would never record routes. So I'm sure we did a couple of new routes on Stack Polly when I was climbing with him. And I said, oh, should we write that up, send it into the SMC? And he flatly refused to do that. He was really old school. It was all about exploring. The Highlands was going to be this pristine wilderness where you just made your discoveries and you kind of learnt your craft as you went. And then I started climbing with John Mackenzie. So Lord John Mackenzie, who wrote the Sky Guide, who has really done more development in the east of Scotland and in Skye than probably anybody else in kind of climbing history. And he's infamous for digging out moss-covered crags, but in the process he's found some total gems. And then John and I, so I would have been at that time probably 16 and 17 and 18, I climbed with John a lot, like every weekend in winter. And he had a key for the gate into Ancorrican, which is the first of the Munros in the Fannis. Yeah. And we did loads of new winter routes. Like I did my first new winter route when I was 15 in there. So it was Clive Rowland and Moantoine, backed off a route because it had avalanched. I went in the following weekend and we did the route. It was just amazing. It was like, and you could go into these crags, huge cliff, and go, oh, that could do that. That was a grade 3, and then that was a grade 4, and that was another grade 4. It's like unbelievable.
All new kind of routing and sounds, well, obviously with some very experienced people to show you the ropes, literally.
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I got from Ian was a total joy of exploring. And then what I got from John was a hunger for first ascents and new routes. And I really loved that. I really liked exploring like that. And John's enthusiasm, it was just, and it didn't matter whether it was a mossy cliff that was 20 feet high or something that was 800 feet high. He was just into everything and madly enthusiastic. And I loved that. So then I went down to Edinburgh, got in tow with the Edinburgh University Mountaineering Club, although I wasn't in the university at all. And I did my first 6 months in Edinburgh working in Tysos as a shop boy. Getting cheap gear, meeting all of these people, met Rab Anderson, Kenny Spence and Cubby and Murray Hamilton and all of those folk who eventually I climbed with for the next 15 years. And it was just immense. It was a really good introduction.
So, yeah, it sounds amazing. It sounds like it couldn't have been any better, essentially, in terms of the people that you're mixing with.
And it was also kind of this sort of naive, unfolding understanding of what Scottish climbing was like at that time. Because you come from the Highlands and you're pretty isolated. We were really isolated. There were 4 or 5 climbers in the whole of the north and the northwest at that time. It was really not very many people. And then I was climbing with 3 of them. So it's like, oh, okay. But then I went down to Edinburgh and then started climbing with, particularly with Cubby and Rab Anderson and Kenny Spence. And I climbed loads of stuff with Kenny all over the place, did new routes I'll tell you about a story about the Ben anyway. But and then with Mal Duff, so climbed a lot with Mal. And Mal was a fantastic character. I really liked his a real eccentric. And then kind of slowly as you get into that scene, you realise, if you're climbing in Edinburgh, there's this club called the Squirrels and the Junior Scottish Mountaineering Club. And then there was all the Glasgow rivalry. And then the rivalry in Aberdeen. And that just became a really big feature. The harder and harder you climbed, the more that kind of influenced what you did. And ultimately, that was one of the reasons I dumped Scottish trad climbing and ended up being really enthusiastic about sport climbing, because it got messy. It was really messy.
In what way? How did that?
Well, I suppose what happens is that when the standard is, that sort of era, like E5 was the maximum kind of on-site standard, and that was rare. And then the big lines in the Duloch and the Ben were still being done. Nobody had placed a bolt in Scotland at that time. And people were just hungry for routes. So there was Dougie Dinwoodie, Murray Hamilton, Cubby, Rab, Kenny Spence, John Mackenzie Spider were all fighting for these lines. And so, one weekend I'd go into the Duloch with Cubby and we'd kind of repeat all the existing routes. We did, I think it was one weekend, we did 4 of the E5s and an E6. It was unbelievable. I mean, he can really climb. And I was kind of swapping leads, and Dave would always do the slightly harder pitches. And then the next weekend I would be with Kenny doing new routes in Fastcastle. It was fantastic. And I loved the dolerite quarries around Edinburgh. There's so much to do. And I think the best one's actually been filled in now. There's a place called Lenny Quarry, which had amazing lines. But yeah, there was just this endless kind of driving down to Northumberland every weekend in the wintertime to go bouldering, and then, local cragging in the spring and the autumn, and then big mountain routes if you could in Skye and all sorts of stuff. So it was a lot of fun. It was a real lot of fun, but it had an edge to it as well.
Right. And because of the competition, because of people wanting to
and it came
first ascend or
it came to a head with myself and Kenny Spence always wanted to do a new route on the Ben, and he roped me into trying to do the first ascent of Banana Groove. So we climbed Shibboleth, got to the top of Banana Groove, spent 2 days cleaning it, brushing it, cleaning out all the cracks, because it was going to be pretty hard. And then I think it must have been the third day we had to go at the route. So climbed the first part of the groove, and then at Caligula, I think, traverses out right, but we were going to go straight up the wall. I led the first 2 pitches, and then Kenny was going to lead the hard pitch, and he got right to the lip of the roof on the top of the Banana Groove, which I think is now E46A. Placed a nut and fell off. Tried again, couldn't do the move. And by that time, I'd been sitting on the belay for about, at least a couple of hours, and was absolutely frozen. So he left the top 2 nuts in the groove and a sling on the big flake on the Caligula traverse, which is loose and really pretty scary. It's a pretty hard pitch. And then we abseiled off, and that would have been on the Wednesday. So I think Kenny must have been during school holidays, because Kenny had time off. And we thought, right, we'll come back on Saturday when we've got more time and do it. And the very next day, it was Murray Hamilton and Rab went up and did the route. And I thought, and Kenny was absolutely, I don't think he's ever spoken to Murray since then. It was really, they swear blind that they just went up for a look.
Yeah.
But the route had gear in it, and it hadn't rained, so there was fresh chalk in it as well. And you think, oh man, there is no loyalty in this game at all. And then, of course, travelling from Edinburgh to going to Glen Nevis, there were so many bits of jiggery-pokery going on with the first ascent. So pre-placed wires, or a peg that was put in and then taken out, or some routes were, top roped and then led. And there was so many grey areas in all of this. I thought, right, I'm utterly fed up with it. I'm going to kill myself trying to repeat a route. And that almost happened on one of the routes on the Whale Buttress. And then you get up there and there's like a head of an RP that's broken off, and think, how did that get? That wasn't placed in the lead. Anyway, there's lots of stuff like that went on. And I just got a bit fed up of all of that stuff. Okay. And that happened at exactly the time I went to the Verdon, and that was a kind of real changer.
Okay. And so when you got over there, was it holiday type? Was it a kind of short spells, or did you base yourself there for a while, or what was the?
Oh well, I by that time, so I first went to the Verdon in 1979, and I met Cubby there. He was climbing with 2 really strong Norwegians, and they were doing, 1-arm pull-ups in trees in the campsite in La Palude going, and I thought, I've never seen anybody that strong, and think there's no way I can get there. But I think it would have been in 1978 or 79, I first went. And then we did a thing called Mira de Fou, which is a 7A, and I climbed a 7A way back then, but it was on caving bolts, and slings and threads, but it was still the very early start of sport climbing. But at that time, there's a photograph of me on the route in EBs with double rope, in a Willans harness, sport climbing 7A. It's like, okay, this is quite good. I'm not going to die.
Yeah.
I can pull as hard as I possibly can. And if I fall off the thing, the consequences, they were a long way apart, the boats, but it wasn't terminal. Yeah. And then we did sort of Lunabong and a bunch of kind of routes. And I thought, wow, this is really, really, really good. Really good.
So sport climbing became your thing then?
Yeah, and that coincided with quite a tragic trip to Chamonix. So my third trip to Chamonix, I went with a bunch of people from Edinburgh. By that time, I thought, right, I'm going to do the Walker Spur. This is what absolutely I want to do. We set off walking up to the Walker Spur, turned around in a storm, went back down to the unofficial Snailsfield campsite, and there were a whole bunch of tents that were full of Japanese climbers. And then the very next day, a whole bunch of gendarmes came into the campsite, armed gendarmes, cleaned all the tents away, and 6 of them, I think, had died on the Walker Spur in that storm on the very days that we'd have been on the route. And I thought, I don't think this is for me. It must, I love climbing,
yeah,
but we were never properly altitude conditioned. And you need to learn a lot about the weather. And yeah, I probably wasn't the fastest on easy ground. I probably one of the slower people. I like to be quite safe and move reasonably safely. But then, when I started working with Cubby, when Cubby was doing the safety stuff and some of the early climbing films we did, to see him walk around on difficult ground, it is a whole different skill set. So I was very good at pulling in small holds, but not running around in crampons on a ridge with 800 feet either side of me. So
yeah, I can understand that. Being there a couple of times, I thought, this could go one way or the other.
Yeah,
literally.
But then that was right at the very start. So Pete Livesey had just written a guide called French Rock Climbing, and it had buttes and a bit of Fontainebleau and some stuff near Marseille, and that was the first articles in Crag magazine. You see people in, climbing. At the time, it had been 7B pluses, I suppose, or 8As at the very most. So I spent all the time I had. I would work as much as I could, save up lots of money, and then go and live in the south of France for long periods, like months and months and months. And that coincided with me graduating from college with a degrees in photography, but I did a sort of film master thing at the end of all of that. And my very first job was with the BBC Natural History Unit, filming Scottish salmon. And I worked for a week and I earned enough money to go climbing for 3 months. And I just went to France. And I did that life for another 12 years.
Right.
So it was...
So you milked it.
Absolutely milked it. Absolutely milked it. And so I'd kind of... I was really lucky as well. I suppose you know yourself, if you've got outdoors kind of skill, there were very few people in the film business that could walk on a glacier, ice climb, live in a tent, and look after themselves in reasonably hostile environments. So I got offered work all over the world. It was amazing. Went to Patagonia, went to the Falkland Islands, went to Svalbard, all over Africa, Mali, Timbuktu, Colombia, Panama, in the deep, deep jungles. And that was really a reasonable technical film skill, but also the fact that I know that I could put a hammock and a tent up and operate when it was wet or cold or super hot. And then look after, part of the job as a camera assistant is to look after the cameraman and the director. So I spent a lot of time making sure people didn't fall out of light aircraft or get punted out of the back of a car. So I'd harness them all up and so on. It was great fun. And at that time you would get paid, I think, £18 a night for camping. And we did a trip that started in Panama City and ended up nearly in Medellin in Colombia, going through the Darien Gap. We did a month trek through the Darien Gap with an American writer. It was madness. It was absolute madness. It was right at the height of major Pablo Escobar drug dealing.
What was the basis of that film?
that was following an American writer called Jonathan Maslow, and he was doing a series of books, doing the whole of the Pan American Highway. But then, of course, that gap is the Darien Gap. That was a wild trip. It was totally wild. And we came across this airfield cut out in the middle of the jungle with these two scuba diving tanks in them. Went, that's odd. What's that? And you tap them and they're totally full. And then the guide who was with us said, right, we have to get out of here now. And they were full of cocaine. So what would happen is a plane would fly them up from Colombia, drop them in this site. They would get picked up by another plane, maybe registered in Mexico or the States, and they'd fly them off the shore of Florida, drop them into the ocean because they were sealed tanks. And that was how they were getting the cocaine into Miami. It was mental. And we were kind of like, yeah, well, this is totally naive. What are these things?
Yeah, you must, yeah.
It was pretty interesting. Yeah, it was really interesting. But that trip, ended up, I think, where did I go after that trip? Yeah, I think I spent 6 months in France after that. It was great. And then I did a music film with the Eurythmics in Australia and ended up staying in the Rapalese for 2 months off the back of that. Just not even spending any of the money I earned. We were given these ridiculous per diems. So I think at the start of the Eurythmics film, it was part of a big RCA Records thing. We were just handed this wodge of Australian dollars. That's what you get to spend a day on food and whatever you want to spend it on. And it was over £1,000 for about 2 weeks. And that was just spending money. It was madness. And that's what funded my Australian climbing trip. It was but the excesses in that were quite weird.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And are all these sort of filming trips, are they through BBC or from different?
No, they were all sorts of stuff. So most of the adventure stuff was all with the BBC, but I did a series of films with Channel 4 about private detectives. So yeah, we were staked out in Texas looking for kids who'd been kidnapped by the Ku Klux Klan. And then drug dealing we did this odd film in the States where we were, this has got nothing to do with climbing, but it funds the climbing trip to Red Rocks that preceded that, of course. So then we were staked out in front of this guy in overnight in a big RV, and we had to have protection with us. And the guy who was our protection officer was an ex-Vietnam vet who sat there with a submachine gun, taking out the magazine, clipping it, cocking the machine, unclipping it. It was madness. It's a real eye-opener. Incredible experiences. We filmed there, we'd staked out this particular house, expecting somebody to be kidnapped from that house for 2 nights, left, went back to the UK. The next weekend, both the parents were killed. And they were shot in the driveway that we were staked out in. And it turned out that it was nothing to do with child kidnapping. It was entirely the fact that the guy had been ripping off one of the cartels and they tapped him when we went away.
Just potentially they were watching you and saw you there and never did anything potentially.
Well, to start shooting British journalists was probably not a very good idea.
Yeah.
So,
probably quite fortunate.
And you think, oh yeah, we're totally incognito, but we're sitting in this huge RV plugged into the neighbour's house, with ice boxes full of ice. It was so hot. We'd sit with our arms in this crushed ice for the night because it was like 120 degrees inside this van. It was bonkers.
So each filming trip followed a climbing trip of some description?
Yeah. And that was until one of my climbing mates in Edinburgh called Jerry Handren moved to North Conway in New Hampshire. And Jerry started working for IMCS climbing school. And that was run by Paul Ross, who's a very famous Lakeland climber. So Paul was British and he employed 2 or 3 British climber guides at that time. And I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to follow Jerry out to the States because we climbed a lot together. I really liked him. And I'll get a job in the States. And that was where I came across my first artificial climbing wall. So they just built a tiny little old fiberglass entreprise wall in a building. And that would have been in probably 1988 or something like that. Maybe 86, even earlier than that. And so I applied to become a member of the American Guides Association, got in there, went all the way through a process of getting a green card with a school called EMS Climbing School, worked for a summer guiding people on, like 5.4s and 5.5s in New Hampshire. And I absolutely loved New Hampshire. It's a great place. And then in 1988, the American economy completely crashed, and that sealed off that green card. But I went back year after year until about 1992, because on Cathedral Cliff in particular, and then in the Frankenura Notch, we were just doing new routes. We're, finishing work, sticking a rope down a line, bolting these edgy granite routes, and we did, like, really, for the time, pretty hard, like 13A, 13B routes. Started off hand drilling the things, and then Jerry bought a Ryobi petrol-powered drill, which ended up burning through the static ropes you were trying to clean routes off. And that was it was pretty controversial. So we were doing Euro-style ethics in quite a traditional climbing area in the States. But I almost felt as though, because you were kind of teleported in from another universe with, by that time, quite a lot of limestone experience in France, I thought, right, these Americans know nothing. We're going to come over and show them what to do. And we did lots of routes, lots and lots of routes. And they're now kind of some of the classics of the crag.
I'm going to say, how long did it take for that to become accepted for you?
Probably did my first new route there in 87, and in 1992 people were pointing at lines at us. But that was, I went back 4 or 5 times, and each trip was about 2 to 3 months. It was great. It was absolutely great. So when I actually graduated from Napier and did that first film job, I phoned up Jerry and said, right, it's October, let's just do a classic American road trip. So that was in 1984, 85. We bought a little 4-wheel drive Subaru. We started in New Hampshire, north of Boston, climbed 2 new routes in there. Then we went to the Gunks. Then we went to, we drove all the way to Colorado and climbed in El Dorado Canyon and did the Prow and all of those. But fantastic place to go. Really, really inspiring. Went to Waco Tanks in the first couple of years and met Todd Skinner, who was bouldering there. Climbed in Mount Lemmon in Arizona and New Mexico. Went to Joshua Tree and met John Backer and had a big argument with John Backer about bolts. And I mean, it was just it was right at that whole time when everything was shifting from a very strong traditional ground up ethic. I remember watching Johnny Woodward do a new route in Joshua Tree, where he was drilling in the lead and taking this mammoth falls. The route was called British Airways, I think, eventually, but with a drill and a sky hook on a little patinaed granite edge, drilling, and then poof, you shoot off into the wilderness. And that the problem with that was there was nothing wrong with the ethic, but the holes that you were drilling like that were all bent and deformed because you're hanging there and they're moving around, and often those bolts would pull. So I thought, that's really not great. There must be a better way. So that was right at the start of wrapping down routes and cleaning them, and even gluing holds on or removing holds. So it was kind of very, very, very controversial, taking all of that French ethic to the States.
Yeah,
sometimes it was accepted and sometimes it really wasn't.
Well, that was going to be my question. How did the kind of local climbing community of that, of the different areas that you went to, how did they kind of accept you, or were you were people curious to what you were doing, or?
Yeah, we were pretty careful not to piss people off out of the territories that we knew were okay. So on the latter trips, when we started really exploring in New Hampshire, there's a great cliff called Sandown Cliff where we did route, and they were like 512, 513, 513A, and a lot of those routes had these kind of odd granite patina. So you'd go down tapping the wall with a hammer, and you go, oh, that's not right, and you could get your fingernail behind the flakes and just break them off. And sometimes that breaking off the flake got to the point where you think, it's not good, this is right on the edge. But then you'd hear stories from City of Rocks with, Tony Nero with a mallet making holds. So you think, and glue everywhere. So looking back in some of that now, it was definitely not great. But then that sets up the foundation for the next lot to do better, especially when you realize that it's a limited resource. There was a whole incident in Glen Nevis I can talk about like that, where I thought, this is not my place to be doing what I'm doing here. But it was very much as like, come from France, full of energy, really young. I'm in the Lycra, you guys are still climbing in jeans. I've climbed AA, it's fine, I can do anything I want. So there was a bit of that for sure. But in New Hampshire, it totally changed the whole sport. And then we discovered Rumney. So Jerry had been to Rumney in I think it must be in Massachusetts, near Manchester, Massachusetts. And Rumney is now one of the premier East Coast places for sport climbing. Jerry bolted a route there. There was only trad climbs there for a while. Jerry bolted a route one spring. I came in the autumn and we did routes like Hope for Donna, which were 12D or 13A. And it was just immense, like acres of rock. But a bit like Dunkeld, that kind of similar rock where you've got very obvious crack features, but the faces were all climbable because they were covered in quartz crystals and edges. It was fantastic. And then to go down from there into New River Gorge and do really early repeats of some of the, the harder routes down there. It was exciting. It was really exciting.
Yeah, it sounds like ploughing a new way, essentially.
Yeah,
or contributing to it.
Yeah, absolutely contribute. I mean, when you go to France, I realised very early on that I wasn't the best climber for sure. And then you go from Edinburgh to Malm, you think, oh, I'm really not the best climber. But I suppose I was kind of good, but not absolutely the best. And then because I wanted to climb for a living, apart from the film stuff, I wanted to get sponsorship and make a bit of money out of that. I decided that the best way to do that was give companies really good feedback. So when I started contacting companies for free rope and free shoes and some money back in the 80s and 90s, I got paid to do some of that, but it wasn't because I was, climbing the very, very top level. It's because I was climbing well enough that people would give me stuff, but then I was good at taking photographs for the companies and I was really good at product feedback. So it's kind of like, okay, where's the gap? How can I plug that gap? And that was, that still works.
Yeah, I think it does still work. And so, when was there ever a point where you come completely away from filming or filmmaking and climbing only, or what was the kind of progression from there?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, that's a good point. So I think there's a point in a film career where you want to change from being shooting second camera, so I did quite a lot of that, but also just being a focus puller and assistant. I mean, if you're a focus puller in feature films, it's a career. It's a very, very specific skill. But there wasn't much of a feature film industry I was involved with. I was much more working with BBC Bristol and then with British documentary companies at the start of Channel 4. But I wanted to be a cameraman, a proper cameraman. And as soon as I suggested that to the 2 or 3 really established cameramen I was working with, they said, oh, we'll just block you. We'll not let you do this. And then...
Why? Because they felt that you'd be a threat to their work then?
Probably.
From a freelance perspective?
Yeah, there's not much really high quality documentary work around, especially travelogues and wildlife stuff. There's not much around. And there would have been 4 or 5 really established good cameramen. I'd worked with them all. And I was quite firmly warned off that. So, but one of the sound recordists I worked with, he said, look, just go away and do something else for a couple of years. They'll forget about you and you can come back and reinvent yourself in this. But keep your hand in, do bits and pieces in the middle. And that coincided with the start of Cairngorm Ropes. So I managed to get into Cairngorm Ropes. I can't remember quite how it worked. I was introduced to somebody and they were looking for somebody to actually work on developing climbing rope. So I got a job with Cairngorm Ropes and I made that job into something that meant I had to spend, poor me, 10 months a year in France. And then
Well, somebody has to do it, I suppose, don't they?
it was probably pretty legitimate, and it was really interesting to work for them, and I learned a lot. How to do stuff well, and then how to do stuff really badly. And the tale of Cairngorm, it's very, very sad. They got a lot of European funding to make climbing ropes that would change colour when they were worn out. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. In principle, it sounds like a really good idea. And then they had 3 years of funding where we were just developing normal climbing ropes. I think I must have climbed on the first 9.5 single ropes. Like a really thin, really strong, very long rope for routes at Orgon Canal, which is like 35 metres long, 40 metres long. And you could see where it could go. But it all started going wrong when the information that because my job was to try and sell the stuff to climbing shops. And we got a really good contract with Vieux Camper, which is the big shop chain in France. Went to a couple of trade shows in Chamonix. And I remember sitting in front of Patrick Gabarou going, okay, these ropes are from Scotland. I've been told they've got this thing called the double dry treatment. And it'll be brilliant. It will not freeze up. It'll be the best alpine rope in the world. And he took 4 ropes from us to go to Patagonia. And they froze solid on a route. And he couldn't get down off the route for a couple of hours. And he came back and phoned us up and said, this is junk. You are never selling ropes in France. And I went to the guy who was making the ropes and said, what have you done here? This stuff's supposed to be amazing. You've told me there's a double dry treatment that's supposed to be the core will not freeze. I said, oh, yeah, it's just, Anyway, at the end of all of that technical stuff, the core treatment that he was doing was the same as everybody else's. And he was just kind of like embellishing the marketing side. And we went from selling ropes to Vieux Camper and selling a lot of them to nothing overnight. And then okay, well, that was a bit of a disaster. So I think they had quite a good contract with some Snow and Rock as well, I think. Same thing happened. The samples that went down to the shop, brilliant. Everybody had these Cairngorm 10.5s or 10.2s, I think they were, and they just lasted really, really well. They were great.
But did they ever get it to change colour when they wore out?
So it did, but it changed colour entirely under the wrong premise. So when they eventually developed this fabric that would change colour, I thought, this is great. So 10 falls, elongation, it's wearing out, fine, it'll work. But it was done by heat. So when they put the first ribbons into the first rope and did the first test falls in the rig that was in Newton Moor, they changed colour because the ropes go up to a certain temperature, change the material colour. It was entirely useless. And it was like, oh my God, how come you haven't understood the basics of this? So it funded 2.5 or 3 years of my climbing, but left me feeling as though, we could have done something if they just concentrated on trying to make really good ropes and hadn't kind of overspun the story. They could still be working now. It was a huge shame. And there was lots of people we brought in through essentially my climbing contacts and the fact that we had we were selling the ropes into France with a Scottish mountaineering history, which they respected. And then also, of course, a lot of UK shops. But it was very easy to see at that point where you can oversell and completely underdeliver. It was such a shame. Such a shame.
It is a shame when brands goes down like that.
And it could still be making the ropes in the Highlands. But anyway, that's a whole other thing. So right at the end of that, it was quite fortuitous. I got a phone call from a guy called Richard Else. And Richard's long-term friend of mine now. I've worked with Richard since 1998, I think. And then we did the history of Scottish mountaineering. And then we did the Edge, and then 2 series of the Face. Then 2 series of wilderness walks with Cameron McNeish. And that was another amazing set of journeys. Went to Vietnam, Baffin Island, Utah, South France. Incredible.
And this is you now in the position of
cameraman.
Cameraman.
Yeah, so I was kind of directing the action from the cliff and then doing all the principal camera work for 5 years. But in between times, I was still going to the States, and I thought, right, go to the States, see how climbing walls are working. Came back to the UK, and the foundry had just opened, and I thought, we really need something like this in Scotland. And that was the start of the Ratho journey. And I had somewhere in the deep, dark archive, I have a letter from about 1992, probably, writing to Sport Scotland saying, climbing's a sport, it's not a hobby, and I want to open a big climbing wall in Scotland. And it took up until, and I worked on that off and on throughout all the time I was filming. And we eventually got the first big bite in about 1989, and got into Sport Scotland, and they said, okay, you need to prove a business plan. I had no idea how to write a business plan. And at the same time, Rab had been climbing with, or knew somebody who was an architect in Edinburgh who was very, very wealthy. And Rab and myself and a guy called David Taylor all formed the Ratho Quarry Company to build Ratho. So my job in all of that process was to raise the money from Sport Scotland through the new lottery fund. And I spent about 6 months writing an application, big, massive grant application for a national rock climbing performance centre for Edinburgh and Glasgow. And we got nearly £1 million worth of lottery money. That's when nobody was really applying for sports lottery funding, and the amounts of cash were enormous. And that money was sitting in a bank, and the plan was to build a B&Q style shed at the South Gyle in Edinburgh, right beside where the new station is now. And it would be in the outskirts of Edinburgh, inside the ring road, serviced by a bus and a train, and all the students could get there. But it was also in the west of the city, so people from Glasgow and all the hinterland of the lowlands could come. Brilliant idea, like perfect, a brand new building, great thing. And then I went off to Chamonix to go snowboarding. And I went off to Chamonix to snowboard, stayed in Vallorcine for a few weeks. And just after Christmas, I got this weird phone call from the architect going, I've bought Ratho Quarry. And I went, oh, why? He said, tarmac, we're going to blow it up. And okay, that's fine. That's a good story.
When you look at it, for anybody who's not familiar with Ratho, it is out of the way still now. But I think it's managed to sort itself out in terms of being people going there and having. Yeah. But I suppose it could be better.
And the climbing legacy, when you think now that there's how many World Cups have been there? There's another one coming this year. It's pretty impressive.
It's managed to establish itself pretty well now.
It's now a phenomenal place, but still, go there in January, have to be pretty hard.
It's like a winter mountaineering trip.
Yeah. At the end of Ratho, I was so fed up living in central Scotland, and I think I'd probably pushed myself right to the point where I just thought, I have to get out of here. So I moved to France with my now ex-wife and did something equally as crazy out there.
Well, it seems going to France seems to be the thing that causes that causes the problems. But
well, that's where the limestone is.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And you moved to France with your family at the time, and what happened? What did you do in terms of outdoor and sort of living? Were you still filming things?
No, by that time. So I had a really bad indoor wall climbing accident in 1988-89 using a tube-style belay device on a 9.2 millimeter lead rope. So I was actually top roping a line in Alien Rock in the church we would just go there and climb miles and miles and miles of plastic to get fit. And I was probably at that point where I think I'd just climbed Austrian Oak or a couple of other, like 8A plus, 8B was my max. But then I was probably in my mid-30s at that point. So it was like, I wasn't going to get any better than that. Mind you, see what people like Neil Gresham and Dave are doing now. It's like,
exactly,
but training was in its absolutely, it's in infancy then. And I was probably part of that movement where to be good, you had to be skinny and not powerful. And I'm glad that's all changed. But, it's constantly bouncing from one pulley injury to the next, or elbow injuries, overtraining, not understanding any of the rehab that we now do and take for granted, really. But at the end of the 80s, people were climbing 8B plus and not doing any rehab at all, and then not eating. So no wonder you blow up your tendons and you have shoulder problems and people have horrific injuries. Anyway, so I was doing one of these multiple lap sessions in Alien, and was right at the top of the wall and slipped off a hold. And my belayer was probably lightly holding the rope. I mean, I'd been on the wall for 20 minutes, so she was probably pretty bored, and was talking to somebody. And as soon as I hit the rope, it burnt straight through her hand, and I decked on a concrete floor from 12 meters. And I remember every millisecond of that fall. And I remember facing, because I'd slipped off a hold, I was kind of shoulders and head falling down first. And I remember righting myself and clipping the edge of a mat and bouncing off the mat onto my back onto the concrete floor. And I took my hand off my left arm. It was over there like that. It completely smashed all the radius and ulna. It was pulp. And I had a compression fracture of my spine and 3 vertebrae, cracked my head slightly. And I remember lying on the ground going, fucking hell, what do I do? And then Peter Watts, who'd just come back from Lhotse or somewhere. So Peter was training to be a paramedic, and she immediately ran over and grabbed my head and went, right, don't move, don't look at your hand, just, I'll talk to you. And she talked to me for 20 minutes until the ambulance arrived. But I remember wiggling my toes going, okay, I haven't broken my back and wiggle my toes. And I wanted to look at my hand because it really hurt.
I bet it did, yeah.
And she said, no, just we'll keep talking. And then I remember being put in a spinal brace on the floor, and thought, oh, maybe this is a bit more serious than I thought. And my spine apparently was in quite a weird angle, but I couldn't really feel it was at a weird angle. And then I remember going into shock in the ambulance, and then them going over the speed bumps that were in Leith all the way up to the Royal Infirmary, going really slow over the speed bumps. I thought, this is a bit weird. They must think something's wrong here. So yeah, I was in a body brace for a bit, and then had some revolutionary surgery on my wrist by some incredible, I can't remember, this must be a CAT scan machine. So they x-rayed it and it's in bits, but they wanted to do, and they were, at that time I was probably reasonably well-known climber, and the surgeon knew that they wanted to save at least some of that functionality. And she did this really long procedure where they would scan the wrist in 3 dimensions, and then with her fingers push the bones back into position. And I'm not sure if they ever put any super glue in there to hold the bits in place, but they didn't cut it open, and then basically manipulated my hand back into place on top of all these little shards of bone, and then put an external fixation. So you can still see the scars actually here. The external fixation on my wrist was in that sort of position to hold it all together while it healed. It was absolutely remarkable.
It does sound amazing.
It was extraordinary. Yeah. I was expecting to...
And was that somebody in the Edinburgh Hospital?
Edinburgh Royal Infirmary,
so
yeah.
Was, all right.
I wish I knew who she was.
Yeah,
I think it was a female surgeon. It was and I'm not sure if that was a revolutionary surgery, but I think because the bones at the top of the wrist were so smashed, it was either fuse it and then it would just been stuck in one particular place, which wouldn't have been great, or try something quite different. It's definitely a different shape, but it works really well.
It still works.
It works really well. So it's kind of like that.
So how long was the sort of before you start getting use of it at all, and then to climbing?
It was 6 months before I could vaguely pull on it, and probably a year before I could do a pull-up. Um, and the back thing were it ended up being 3 compound fractures of vertebrae. They healed pretty quickly. I was only in a brace for a very, very short while. So they weren't as bad as they thought. But it kind of gives you a really good appreciation of how quickly things can change. Like instantly. Just a little momentary lapse of concentration. So I'm a total stickler now with my belayers.
I think there's a lot of that, and just when you look about in a climbing wall, you can see a lot of kind of sort of lax attention. And I've seen it a couple of times myself.
Yeah, and that was right in the process of starting Ratho. So all those things combined together at the same time. It was a pretty interesting period. And then the big thing for me, and it's only recently healed itself, was confidence in falling. That mental trauma of having such a, I didn't do anything wrong. I was tied in, the gear worked, the rope didn't break, but actually the system failed through personal failure, human error.
Yeah.
And that it took me years to get over that. It was, and at the time when I broke my wrist, I was climbing 8A plus, and I've never climbed that grade again. And it's only in the last few years, really, since climbing with really people I trust, maybe in the last 5 to 8 years, where I've thought, right, I'll quite happily take a big lob leading. But before that was, and what that did was kind of open up a whole new set of routes. So I climbed lots of quite long alpine rock routes. So at the end of all of that process with Ratho, we moved to France, to Samois, which is between sort of Morzine, Leger, and then Chamonix. So it's kind of in a little valley. A beautiful place underneath the Grand Massif ski area. I really got into my snowboarding there, and really got into road biking because we were on one of the big famous Tour de France hills. So I got into road biking, did loads of kind of 8, 10, 12 pitch limestone rock routes in the Haute-Savoie, which, again, not in the glacial alpine, but routes in Point-Percy and in the Savoie, and the fantastic stuff. And that was a different focus for climbing. And that's where I kind of really got involved in thinking, actually, it's not about chasing a grade. It's not about performance. It's simply about enjoying the basic movement of climbing. And I knew that always. And I always knew that, chasing the grade as a career thing was destined for absolute, there's a point where progression stops, and then you have to come to terms with that lack of progression and go, well, why am I doing this? Why am I training? Why am I hanging off this fingerboard? Why am I road biking to keep reasonably fit and light? And it has to be more than just the grade. And so many people I climbed with over the years, when they stopped improving, they stopped climbing because they didn't love it or didn't love it enough. And I think that is very, very common.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the first name that kind of springs to mind, and I know he's still climbing and he's still doing, is Jerry Moffat. I don't think he does a lot of climbing. I think he obviously had a big injury. I think the last I heard he was surfing. On the last kind of thing I heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think lots of people did that, and I think that's where you start looking at the character and there's no doubt at all, to be good at climbing, you need to have quite an obsessive element to your character, and I'm freely admit that, and freely apologise to all those poor girlfriends who I made suffer for all of those years just being a complete narcissist when it came to going climbing. Nothing else mattered.
Yeah. I met a guy recently. Well, it was about a year or so ago now, and he was a bit like that with kayaking. He said, I think my girlfriend's going to move to London for university, so I'll probably break up with her. And that was because the only thing was kayaking. He kayaked at quite high levels.
Well, I hope it wasn't as brutal as that, but certainly it was like, I'm away. I'm going away for 3 months. Come with me, great, but actually I'm going to hang on a rope and work out this move in this AA in France for hours and hours and hours and hours until I get it. It's like unbelievably boring if you're not interested in climbing, and unbelievably selfish if you're not doing that with a similar grade partner or somebody who's equally as committed. They might be climbing 6B and doing that. But that process it's absolutely overwhelming when you're in it. But to view that from the outside must be terrible to witness.
Selfish, I think it's
very
a lot of time. Actually, in an interview I mentioned earlier with Simon Yearsley, he said he's got a sign on the side of his desk, and he is a husband, a father, and an alpinist. Just sometimes not always in that order.
Yeah,
and that's how he rationalises it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are wanting to do the best you can, and especially when we were, there was a whole bunch of people. So Cubby, Murray Hamilton, Rab, Kenny Spence, who, when I started climbing him, he was called the Olgian, and he was 48. So I'm now well older than that, and I'm still hanging off my fingerboard. They were the kind of absolute obsessives, were out all the time, and it was great to be part of that. It was interesting to be part of that climbing. So going from a really traditional mountaineering apprenticeship to looking at that alpine career as a possible thing, to going through all that transition to sport climbing, tight shoes, sticky rubber. When I first climbed on Etive slabs, we were climbing in EBs. Now it's like super sticky rubber and cams that work. And it was right through, I bought the first Friends. I bought the first offset rocks. All of those things were kind of developed when we were climbing at a high level. And almost you get another innovation in equipment, and then suddenly it opens up a whole new set of routes and a whole set of things that were potentially not very safe, but then suddenly were a bit more safer. And you combine that with the slowly unfolding knowledge of how to train
and sustain it.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly that those kind of things like offsets and cams are all, that's part of climbing now. It's all the generation and before coming through now. It's just part of the climbing rack now.
Yeah, I remember as a kid getting my first check for £17 from working in the auction mart, chasing cattle up and down a field, and then writing off to, it must have been Field and Trek in those days, and buying Bonatti aluminium carabiners, because John at that time when I was climbing them still had sort of steel ex-World War II surplus. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, the first rope I climbed on was a Kermantle rope, a twisted rope, and it was like Viking twisted rope from probably the early 70s. And now I think, the narrowest rope I've got is about 9.3 or 4.
Single, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. It's absolutely extraordinary.
It is unbelievable. So you moved to France with your family.
Yeah. And we did a really grand designs chalet disaster. We bought a big barn. So when I was in the film business, I thought, right, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is buy a flat. I bought a flat near Easter Road, and then just sort of traded up through all of that massive. When you bought a flat for £30,000, you could sell it 3 years later for 60. And you can't do that these days, but people who invested in property at that time had the real opportunity to have cash in the bank. So took all of that money out of Edinburgh, bought a barn, converted the barn. Halfway through converting that barn, the principal contractor that we brought in to do the building, he was from Moldova, but told us he was from France. He did a runner with 100 grand, left us with no walls, no roof, no septic tank, 2 kids under 5 in the middle of a French alpine winter. I mean, it was like, oh my God, everything I've ever earned for 25 years is now gone. And we put money into this building, and it's a frame. It's nothing. It's all gone. So to give my ex her due, she really pulled it out of the bag and didn't pay people. We just found people to just work in the building, and we just fed them. And at that time, after Ratho, I got a contract with a number of big property companies, helping them put adventure sports into shopping centres and retail parks. And it was right at that time when retail parks were becoming more like theme parks. and they knew that increasing people's dwell time in a building was the way to make more money out of them. So I consulted in projects in California, in Slovenia, in Germany, in Poland, in Paris, and all over the UK with these people like British Land and Eurofund and big property companies, Cushman and Wakefield. They're kind of and there I was, like, filmmaker climber sitting in front of multi-millionaires going, yeah, you need to build a climbing wall, you need to build a bouldering center, you need to build a skate park, you need to build a high ropes course inside a snow dome. So yeah, there was a couple of people who I worked with. So we built a high ropes course in the Xscape in Castleford, and I did the early designs for the ones in Glasgow. And that was where we funded the completion of this French chalet. And the idea was to finish all of that property stuff and then make a living in a really nice place, teaching yoga and climbing and having skiers come in the wintertime. And we managed that for a couple of winters, and it was, on paper, idyllic, absolutely idyllic. And I love that part of the world. But when it goes wrong there, the French system is not kind. It's pretty tough.
And were you full through winter and things like that? And you have plenty.
Yeah.
And imagine it's constant for you and
Yeah.
and your wife at the time to be working there.
Yeah, that was pretty
allow
interesting.
you free time?
No, not really. But taking people and showing them a ski resort isn't exactly hard work. Putting them in the van in the morning, driving them to a ski lift, going up in the lift with them and going, if you go there, that's blue. If you go there, that's black. And I was really careful not to do that kind of chalet ski guiding thing, because most of my friends in France were all mountain guides, and that was like a really bad thing to be doing. And there was always that blurred line with, hill walkers calling themselves guides, people with a CWI instructing. It's like, it's not good. It's not good at all. So I avoided that in France, but, going to Flaine and hanging around and say, I'll meet you for lunch at 12. I mean, it wasn't exactly arduous. But we were really at the very early part of offering people discounts if they didn't travel by car or by plane. So it was an eco chalet, so it was all organic food. If they traveled by train, we gave them a massive discount on their holiday, trying to encourage people to be green. It wasn't revolutionary in terms of thinking, but it was revolutionary in terms of people doing that.
Yeah, what other
in
people offer.
business.
Yeah. And I haven't looked for a while for that type of thing, but is that quite common now to encourage that, or
it's almost been completely mainstream.
Yeah.
We were carbon offsetting all the heating. We put in a wood pellet boiler, and all the wood source was coming from, waste, building waste. We did a lot of things really interesting there, using recycled material for all the insulation. We over-insulated the house, like 300 mil insulation in the walls. So even in the middle of winter, the building was passive at -15. And it was a huge building. It had 8 bedrooms and a massive open plan downstairs. It was kind of quite cool to see, but that's now been adopted by most people. If you're not going to an alpine chalet, which is making at least some attempt to preserve the environment that you're going to play in, you're not going to the right place.
No, I think the industry is now quite educated in that way. So
you'd like to think.
You would like to think so. I wish it was more widespread, but
yeah,
maybe we'll get there before all the ice caps melt.
When talking about that, so when I first went to the Alps in 1978, and then when was the last time I was in Chamonix? Just before the start of the lockdowns. The mer de glace has dropped 100 meters and receded 3 kilometers. I mean,
when you go there and you see the markers as you go,
it's
as you go
outrageous.
down into it, it's heartbreaking.
And the Bossons Glacier, when I first went to Chamonix, probably in 77, 78, You could walk to it from the valley in 5 minutes, and it's now, it's hundreds of meters higher. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking.
And all those north faces were summer routes, and now they're winter. They're all winter routes. I mean, you could climb the north face of the Matterhorn in July, and it would be covered in snow. I mean, you're not going near those things in the summer now, unless it's really unusual weather.
Yeah, and it's not going to turn back, is it? So we're not going to get that back.
That's at very, very different times.
Yeah, definitely. So after the chalet venture, did you stay in France after that?
Yeah, so my ex moved back to the UK eventually after kind of much toing and froing with my 2 kids, who then ended up in school in Kent. And I stayed out and met my current partner, and that's been now, Sophie and I have been together for now nearly 12 years. Yeah, it'll be 12 years. And yeah, it's been brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. It's great to have a mate.
Yeah, she likes a bit of adventure.
Yeah, totally. So we met in France, and then Soph dumped a job in the UK, and we ended up living in Saint-Gervais for a few years. And I loved living in Saint-Gervais because there's a really nice scene there. There's a good integrated British guiding community, and lots of people who were professional people who weren't trying to make money out of tourism. And I think if you go to Léger or Morzine or Chamonix, lots of people are scrabbling around trying to make a living from British tourists. Most of the people in Saint-Gervais at that time weren't. They were really quite integrated into the French system, and it felt completely different. And we lived there for ages. I took up trials motorcycling and got myself a motorcycle license. And I was still doing quite a lot of property stuff at that time, and then quite a lot of work for the adventure show. The adventure show presenting had started by then, so I'd fly back, work for the BBC for a week, and then go snowboarding again. And to be in Le Contamine and those sorts of places when it's just had a fresh dump in the middle of January, there's nobody around, and you have your own private lift system. It was amazing, absolutely amazing.
So the adventure show, and I don't think it's widely known in sort of south of the border, but it's a BBC Scotland TV show, and it goes around in the different kind of adventure type races and things in Scotland. And you've moved from behind the camera there to in front of the camera.
So it's the same production company that did The Edge and The Face when I was a climbing cameraman, to then producing the adventure show as a mainstream kind of BBC Scotland, almost like a magazine programme. And I got a phone call from Richard saying, I'm thinking about doing this new thing for the BBC. Do you want to come and trial as a presenter? Dougie Vipon's the main presenter. You know him. He's the drummer from Deacon Blue. Hadn't got a clue until I kind of met him. I'd been living away.
Yeah, that's true.
And so Dougie was obviously heading that up. And then my role was to be the specialist mouthpiece person. And because I ski, or I don't ski, but I snowboard, I mountain bike, I road bike, I climb, I do a bit of kayaking, but I'm really bad at it, and deep water scares me. But I've done a bit of canyoning, all those things. And I think when it comes to talking a good game, by the time having gone through all of the Ratho stuff and then selling adventure sports to property developers, by that time I knew what language I should be using. And that is a gift, I think. It's a gift, not my gift, but it's a gift that I've gained from being active in the outdoors pretty much all my life.
And being across different areas of the industry as well, by the sound of it, through this chat. So it's given you that kind of broad spectrum of experience. And
I love talking to athletes. There's nothing more exciting than talking to somebody who's at the top of or have just finished a run in Fort William, and they can visualize every single rock. But talking to them about that process, talking to them about the process of warm-up, training, performance, moments of flow that people get into, it informs my sport all the time. You try and you learn from those people because they are absolutely the best in the world. And then you think, okay, that's what I can take to try and at those points where you do reconnect at a reasonable level for your own performance into a sport, you think that's how it feels, and it's a gift. It's an absolute gift.
I mean, it's one of the main reasons I do this podcast is to listen to people and how they interact with their part of adventure and or their sport and how they've approached it through their life and how that's influenced them. That's 100% why I do this. So,
I mean, I suppose for me, one of the things that I would say about from the moment I started climbing, that I may well have been at the sort of the cutting edge of something, but I was always learning from somebody who was slightly better than me, and then kind of adapting that so I could use those skills. You know, when I was living in the kind of Central Massif in France and trying to climb a lot in the Ardèche, you know, there were days where you would kind of climb with these young French climbers who were probably 10 years younger than me when I was living there, and then going, oh wow, they've done 8A in a day, right, that's my target. There's a new cliff with all of these wonderful 8As and 8A pluses. Let's see if I can do an 8A plus in a day. And being motivated and learning how they use their feet and watching them climb and watching how they push into things. So much of that alpine climbing is using your feet, or because I was never very good at the really, really steep stuff, because I'm probably a bit weedy in the arms and too long to be really good at the super powerful stuff. But then when it came to slightly overhanging walls like you'd find at Upper Cave Crag, for instance, that's absolutely where I'm at. And then I went to Dunbar and met a kid called Malcolm Smith pulling on the tiniest wooden holds in his bedroom. And you think, bloody hell, that's the next step. That's the next step. And what he could do at the age of 16 and what I'd been doing when I was 35 were light years apart in terms of strength. And you think, that's the next generation. And that keeps coming.
Yeah, definitely. Looking at some of the people coming up through the climbing ranks now, and
yeah, like Will Bosey and Max the Future.
Yeah, Max the Future. Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah,
Scottish as well.
Yes.
Oh, that's Ratho.
There you go.
I'll take that.
Yeah, definitely.
And then up here, there's some really strong young kids. Really good.
Yeah, it is a different world. It's yeah, and I hope they get the outdoor apprenticeship though that they I say they should get. It's just my opinion, but I hope they get that.
Well, this I suppose kind of neatly segues into what I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. So, having done that whole thing in France, and then kind of going, yeah, it's that was the start. People starting to talk about separating from Europe, and the disaster that's been. All of that kind of, you were just getting to the point where the property work in the UK, flying back to London every couple of weeks, having these meetings, was just beginning to dry up, because again, that's part of an economy having lots of spare cash. Some of the projects that they were talking about in Eastern Europe were like £45 million shopping centres, which were going to have the biggest skate parks in the world. And I mean, a few of them have been done. And there's a really big one in Zaragoza in Spain I was pretty involved in right from the start, and that has surf machines, a skate park, 2 climbing walls, a high ropes course. It's like, to be part of that early vision is fantastic, and it's now got hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. But that suddenly went property to, I think, what was the last big property crash? Was it 2018?
Yeah, there was definitely, I think there was a dip then. Yeah.
There was a dip. That kind of went, okay, this is not looking good. And that combined with my mum, who was living in Dingwall still, was really getting pretty frail. So I thought, right, okay, I need to come back. I need to come back, because my sister at the time was living in the Far East and my brother is in America. So I was like, I'm the closest one, and I was in France. So right, okay. And I spent more and more and more time coming back here and thought, Inverness has changed. It's really changed. So I hadn't lived up here since the end of the 70s. Came back and went, oh my God, there's loads of mountain biking, and the climbing's really good, and there's sport climbs everywhere, and the trad climbing is suddenly great because you've got all these cami tweaky things you can put in little cracks. And I thought, oh yeah, and then anyway, so ultimately through coming back and being exposed to the Highlands and meeting up with people who I'd known pretty much all my life, and rekindling with the area, Soph and I moved back from Saint-Gervais with the express desire to open a climbing wall in Inverness. We started talking about it back in 2014 or 15. We moved back a couple of years after that. And that's when things started with the ledge, which has now been 7 years of bashing my head off a wall to try and get this thing open. Yeah. It's been a long, long process.
Yeah. I'm not talking about it now, but obviously I was involved a little bit at the last venue that you were looking at, and there were some difficulties there, and then we got COVID on top of that, and everything else. That must have been a bit of a stress. But you're now at a position where you have a building.
Yeah, so there's two major turning points for that. One was when we had a really good conversation with a guy called David Haas. So he is the ward councillor for, I think it's Ward 14 or 17, which includes Merkinch and other areas of Inverness. And that's when you start getting into all the politics of this. The funding for the Ledge Centre is really political. So there's a thing that the Scottish Government use called the Index of Multiple Deprivation. And that basically looks at housing estates throughout the whole of the country and rates them as a percentage. So the lower the percentage of that area, the more ingrained multiple complex issues are of poverty, drug taking, endemic alcohol, lack of school attendance, childhood pregnancies or teenage pregnancies. And there's a couple of areas in Inverness where they're amongst the worst. I mean, it's hard to think about it, but they're amongst the worst in Scotland. Worse than some of the really bad ones in Glasgow. And they're not huge numbers of people, but their issues are absolutely tough and ingrained, and they've tried a lot of different things to try and give people more opportunities. So when I started thinking about that and learning about that a bit more, we thought, okay, the way to run the Ledge project is we'll start a charity, and then we'll use the profits from running what would be a commercial climbing wall, use all of that surplus rather than going into my pocket, because I've earned a living in climbing and mountaineering and talking about it and filming it and taking photographs of it. It's kind of like, maybe it's time to put something back. It's not completely altruistic because I still need to make a living, but there's a really big part of me, which you've just mentioned, the benefit of going outdoors and then having some space and having some time. For me, if I hadn't discovered climbing at 13, I have no idea. No academic, real success at school. Left school with one hire. That's not going to get me to university. It's not going to get me a job with lots and lots of prospects. I didn't want to go offshore because I wanted to go climbing all the time, completely selfishly. So the fact that somebody gave up their time to take a bunch of useless kids into the hills has completely changed my life. And if I can do that to one or two people a year, or just one person, and then they have a new future, I mean, it's a huge buzz to think about that, and it'll be an amazing gift.
Well, yeah, definitely. And I know there's a charity with before Urban Uprising who do a kind of similar thing. And
my hope is that we'll become the northern outpost of that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can well imagine it would. Yeah. And the benefits for people to give them that. And again, you hear these stories even on podcasts I do, but other podcasts and other things where if it wasn't for climbing, if it wasn't for running, if it wasn't for, then who knows where that individual might have been.
And it's very hard to imagine now, because I've been doing this so long, another path. And there's no doubt over the years I've had multiple different kind of iterations of careers based on this, but it's all, the foundation's the same. And you need to be, modern parlance, it's being agile. You need to try and see the next thing, or try and create stuff. I mean, nothing has been harder than the last 4 years of fundraising for this project. It's been, we've had planning permissions for 2 separate buildings. We before we've secured this building, we'd secure a private funder, £3.5 million, a new build site on the edge of Inverness. And when that fell apart, after 3 years of work, it was like, oh God, do I have the energy to do this?
Well, I was going to ask that
anymore?
question. How did that affect you personally? These kind of...
I think you need to ask Soph what that was like. But I suppose because by the end of at some points there was no alternative but to go on, because you were so deeply in it. You just thought, right, if I don't get this off the ground, I don't have a job, I don't have a salary, I've got no way of earning a pension, and I'm utterly stuffed because I can't walk into another job. You know, it's hard when you're over 50 to find a job, and you know, who's going to employ an old cranky climber? And of course there are always jobs there. I know people in the industry, and I could hope maybe have picked up a job with one of the bigger brands, but I was so focused on the climbing because I love the fact of creating stuff, and I'm probably not a great employee because I've been used to being my own sort of person.
Agile, as you said before.
Yeah, for a long time now. And since, long before Ratha, I was always trying to create something, and I love that process. So we started, and then very, very quickly after starting this, I thought, right, okay, there's a massive need in the Highlands. I remember as a kid talking to kids of my age, when they're 14, 15, who lived in Liverpool, and the mountains were a barrier. They were not somewhere, they weren't a playground, they weren't somewhere to enjoy. They were a barrier between going from one party or one bottle to the next. And that's still to a degree the case. If you're not involved in the outdoors, the Highland landscape is a complete nightmare if you're a kid. The distances are really long. There's not many people in villages. But you look at the kids in those villages who have discovered mountain biking or climbing, they're different people. They've got, they travel the world because the sports open up all of those different avenues. And to give that gift to somebody else, having experienced it way back in the 70s, is a really, really big motivating factor for me. And that all of that then combined with the fact that people are now talking about green blue space therapy, and especially post-pandemic, there's never been a greater need for projects that improve people's mental health, gives them the tools to take a breath and take a step back from doing something that might be self-harm or drug taking or violence. So the cool thing about the charity is that, and when I'm kind of split in my motivations. I want to have a really good, very successful climbing centre with really good holds, really excellent route setting, a fun bunch of people to work with, and a place that when I'm absolutely bollocksed and covered from chalk from head to foot, which I tend to do when I'm bouldering or climbing, I can go upstairs and have a really good coffee. So that's what...
That's the priorities.
That's depending on the day you catch me, that's either 100% of the motivation or 10% of the motivation. And then the other side of it is that the more that I develop with now partners have come on board, and we've managed to persuade a lot of really good people to come in on board now, developing a social impact program, which we're kind of talking about vertical living. The concept is of rising above through the media. We'll use the charity's not there to create lots of really good climbers. The charity's to use climbing and the outdoor experience as a tool so that it gives you the resources to help you react better in bad situations. And that's a really cool thing. It's not necessarily about getting people to do pull-ups at all.
I think that, and I see it myself. I've got a young daughter, and I think dealing with adversity just on a general level is not. I am blamed for that. It's probably my fault. But I think in general, kids don't have that ability. I'm generalising here. I'm waffling a little bit as well. Kids are in a very comfortable life. And I think even falling off a climbing wall or a bouldering wall is too big a thing for them sometimes at the start. And I think if you're able to give that to somebody, that gift of I can climb to capacity, and if I fall off, it's fine.
Yeah.
And I think that's
I think
adjust
it's
the
almost,
mindset slightly as well.
yeah. I mean, I think it's even more basic than that. So right at the end of running the chalet in France, we were doing quite a lot of family holidays, and it was absolutely shocking to me to see young kids who were probably 11 to 16. Really, that's when the kind of parents, right, come on, we're not going to a beach, and they don't want to go to a beach and they're bored. That they couldn't walk along a path that was slightly uneven, or walk up a steeper path to get to the base of a crag, or walk for more than 10 minutes without wanting to sit down. And if you've never faced that, and you suddenly see that in that very stark reality that walking along something that might be slightly rubbly is a massive challenge, you think, oh my God, where's that kid's life? It's entirely on flat concrete.
Yeah. And just looking at it as looking at a hill, not even a mountain, but just looking at a hill and thinking, can't go up there.
Yeah, and
it's a change of mindset.
It really is. It really is. And I think then you think, well, we've got a third of the population under 21 is obese. And then, we have one of the trustees who is deeply, deeply involved in social and welfare programs in Murrayshire. We had a trustees meeting just a couple of days ago, and he said there's been a 700% increase in referrals with people with mental health issues through isolation, stress, disillusionment, interaction with social media. And these are kids who are, there was all of that in not to the same degree, but lots of people, I particularly can relate to that sort of isolation as a child. But it's now got to the point where that is a really, really big problem, a growing problem. So you have to give people something, or try and introduce them to something, not give them it. You're trying to introduce kids to something that actually turns a little key, that opens a door, a wee spark. And then if you can find them, the ones who it doesn't work for, that's fine. Let's hope they find something else. But those few a year that you go, right, that's really could change their life, then I would love to be able to do that. That's why we're doing this now. So many of the grant applications and so much of the funding. Sport Scotland have a really good thing now. They've decided that yes, medalling is good because it creates the headlines, but Sport for Life and Sport for All is something that they've talked about for years. And the more and more and more you talk to the people who work there, and the more and more you interact with Scottish Government at sort of policy making level, they get it now. They get the fact that team sport's great, but when you stop playing a team sport at 25 because your works team is disbanded or you've hurt your knee, what are you going to do? And people, you can see that you play, if you're lucky enough to have sport at school, a lot of people just don't do anything after that because they're not motivated by something to go into. And one of the things I was talking about throughout all my stuff with all these property developers and through all the grant applications is that a lifestyle sport has to be the thing that you introduce people to, whether it's road biking or surfing or kayaking. It's something that you can do from a young age, so you're learning new skills, and it's all that cognitive spatial awareness and determination and being used to failure and working as a team, all that kind of traditional outward boundy stuff. But really, there's guys up here who are climbing rock climbing 6Bs and 6B pluses, and they're in there well into their 70s, and it keeps them alive. They go to the climbing wall to hang out with the kids. They go climbing with people a quarter of their age, and that cross-generational pollination, it's fun. I mean, I'm now getting to that point. So I climb with people who are half my age, more than half my age, and I love it. Absolutely love it.
So what does the ledge need? What is its next level? What do you need from businesses, or what do you need from the community?
Well, I suppose the best way we need cash to finish it off so we can get the doors open. So we need pretty big, a good philanthropist who's interested in what we're doing, or lots and lots of small donations of a fiver. We tried our own crowdfunding, and I think we maybe have priced that 30, 40, 50 quid. It's probably a bit too expensive. So we're now launching a crowdfunding.co.uk probably in a couple of weeks' time, and we'll start that at any donation at all. So we've got a big gap in funding. And if you'd asked me in November, I'd say, no, we're fully funded. But steel's gone up 20%. Shipping costs have gone up 20%. Materials generally across the board have gone up. So we're facing a budget deficit in pure raw capital terms. And it's significant. I think we'll get there. Well, we have to. We've got the keys, and we're just putting the contractors in to strip out all the buildings. So as they strip out, I need to be raising more and more money to feed the beast. And I want to open with a fully functioning place. I don't want to leave out the floor of the yoga studio. I don't want to not have the strength and condition equipment that we've guaranteed that we'll put in for Sports Scotland and Mountaineering Scotland to make it a performance centre. We could do that, but then if I don't get the 50 grand in for the gym equipment, then we might never have a gym, because where are you going to get that once it's open? So it has to be a fully functioning, full service centre that works from 2 years old to 72 years old or beyond. So there's a gap, but also we're now working on programmes with active schools, with Highland Council Social Work Department, with Highland Hospice is quite an interesting one. So we're working with Highland Hospice on a programme for a bereavement programme. So any child who's lost a parent or sibling through a terminal illness or violence or a shock death, we're working with Highland Hospice to design a 12-week programme so that we can give them a place to go. As simply as opening the door, that they can sit down with a mentor or a friend over a cup of tea and have a chat, all the way through to doing camping trips with the kids and building confidence and creating new friendships and new relationships, and then offering them something which provides them with a horizon that they can move towards. One of my big issues with the kind of traditional outward bound model is that you show somebody this window into this magical adventure sports world, and you do it for 2 days and they go, thanks very much, we're on to the next group. And it's cruel. You'd almost rather not show somebody that way.
Yeah, well, it kind of leaves the person who wants to do it to now
struggle.
And to find where they want to go with it.
Yeah, so I think we're likely to run 3 different levels of programs. One is very much that early introduction for a mass audience, and then the 3 or 4 people, if you introduce 100 people to climbing, 3 or 4 people go, yeah, that's for me. That's great. And if they can fund themselves to come through the door and they've got motivated parents, they'll be there all the time, because it makes a difference to that kid or that young person or that young adult. The next level is very much like that sort of urban uprising where you work with people for a longer period. It's a 12-week program where there's a component of psychology built in there with a little hint of something that is a developing program. It starts with introducing to new people, movement in another dimension. I mean, I don't know about you, but every time I go from a flat surface onto a wall is an immediate thrill. After all of these years, going from the horizontal to the vertical still is it's a magical moment. It's almost otherworldly to me.
You mean. And it's time to change the kind of way you look at things and how everything works.
I love it.
Go, yeah.
I mean, whether it's as long as they're steep enough so when I fall off I'm not hitting anything, and we've got all these conglomerate cliffs here that you can climb at a very moderate level of sport climbing grade, and still it's vertical. It's fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
So the plan is to take people from then door, introduce indoor, and then there'll be programs to go outdoor with.
Yes. So unusually for a climbing wall, we're going to run a big outdoor program. our social impact director, who's moving up from running a special school in Yorkshire, he deals with kids that are either about to go into prison or coming out of prison, and they run a big sort of transition program. We will do exactly the same thing here. So there is no residential special school in the Highlands that I can think of, and they're sent to, Dundee and Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's a fortune every year to do that. It costs Highland Council hundreds of thousands of pounds per child per stay. So if you can divert one kid to not go there, it's worth £250,000. If you divert loads of them, or it might not be through us, it might be through another charity, then you're really doing, it's a great fiscal thing for the council and for the region, but also then you're introducing people into a pathway that might well be in the background or inform them all their lives, and it's an amazing thing.
And then you mentioned a third.
Yeah, so I suppose the three really big programs are working with kids who are suffering through bereavement of some kind, then working with that sort of group that I suppose I would have been in, that sort of lower middle, unheard, quiet one who's really struggling to find out what they're going to do. They might not be into team sports. They might not come from a family with very much money. They might be really suffering from isolation or whatever it's going to be. Those kids are part of that sort of 12-week tier 2, it's called, if you have to use the kind of way that it's all divided up. And that will provide them with constant access for a long period of time, and they can become part of something that gives them a sense of place, and then direct them towards that kind of vocational output that would be linked with UHI, for instance. And then there's the tier 3, which are the more complex young people who are either about to go to jail or have come out of jail, are really stuck in very difficult circumstances, which mean that their horizons are very short, and the world that they live in it's very difficult to see out of that. So if you're a single parent with 2 kids in a difficult place, and then your mum's an alcoholic, they've not had a job, what are you going to do? Where do you go? And you don't see any value in education. You're just going to repeat that again and again over generations and generations. So the idea with the tier 3 work is that it's very long-term, 12-month program. It comes with all the professional backup that you can have from a clinical psychologist, somebody who works. So we're working with Nikki Diggins at UHI on developing life skills pathways leading to either further education or employment.
So it's a real long-term process to break the cycle, not to break
it. And there's no doubt at all. And I'm not very well equipped with, I want my climbing wall to be clean and pristine and quiet and somewhere where I can go and train and it's all good. And I know the benefits of what we're doing, but I know that I'm not the person to sit down with that really difficult kid who's completely blown their top because, they're frustrated at something. And the normal way that you vent frustration if you've got really complex issues is to self-harm or be violent or to storm out. And constantly testing that boundary of, do they really want me here? Yes, we do really want you here. So yeah, we'll allow you to make mistakes and we'll allow you to go so far. But when you've got to that point where you're beginning to progress, there will be rules. And those are the rules that give you access to come back. And then it becomes this recycling process of learning that you need to maybe turn up in time. Something is turning up for an appointment. For a lot of people is a monumental challenge. If you've not had any decent meals over the weekend, and the only thing that's in a fridge, if you've got one, is a crappy lager or a bottle of vodka, then how do you expect somebody to turn up to school and go, I'm going to sit down and read a book?
Yeah, extension span and
yeah, it's really complex, and we're going to try and run a breakfast club on a Monday morning and a supper club on a Friday. So at least if you've not had any decent food over the weekend, you can come in and we'll feed you. And then on a Friday night, before you go back into that, and you're coming out of the school meals program, if you're on supported school meals, you can go away and take some porridge pots from Fuel 10K or whatever it's going to be, and you can at least stash them and have something to eat over a weekend. And when you think about, it sounds all very dramatic, but those problems are real and they're endemic and they're very hard to break those cycles.
Yeah. It's like you say, it'll be a long one to have somebody at that degree. It'll take time and investment, and obviously then that's going to lead to requirement of financial backing. So I suppose it's
to employ a clinical psychologist who will work with the bereaved kids, the kids who are lost and lonely and alone, and then the really complex kids in the tier 3, the most difficult. It's a big task. It's a big task. So we're slowly assembling a team of people who can work on that. And that's not even getting close to dealing with people who are deaf or are blind or who are disabled or in a wheelchair. All of that work we'll do as well. But the big stuff is interesting. It's really interesting.
Definitely, and I can tell that you're obviously very passionate about it, and obviously put a lot of effort. You and the rest of the team have put a lot of effort into it. And then obviously, I suppose there's the people that just want to come climbing.
Totally. So
and there'll be all that as well.
So that was quite interesting. So the last time when I ended up doing the climbing wall design work in Ratho. So Rab and I sat down with the guys from Austria who built the climbing wall, and at that time, I think it's nearly 2,000 square meters of wall down there. They went away and did the design work, and they came back and went, "Oh, this is what we'll design." And we went, "Move that here, move that there, and by the way, just give us a couple of thousand holds." Nowadays, you can't do that. So my hold budget is absolutely enormous, and I thought, I'll contact all the hold companies and I'll buy the bolt-on holds for the bouldering wall. As soon as I started looking at how that would work, I thought, I can't do this any longer. It's a really complex process, and if you think that a little PU chip, £3, fine, I can buy thousands and thousands and thousands of those. But then if you put that on a steep wall, is it a foothold? How does that work? You look at all the modern bouldering. So we're destined to become the performance centre for bouldering for Climb Scotland, Mountaineering Scotland. So we're building a replica of the Tokyo Olympic wall and the Paris wall in the back of the building. And those problems are on big volumes. They often involve dynamic moves that are part of modern bouldering. And I'm way too old school to be able to work out how to buy those holds to make sure that we can set in colours and then have somebody who is climbing a font 5 use one of those big lovely volumes that are really complex and featured, and then use that similar volume but a different shape to work with somebody who's climbing V15 or 8A boulder problem. So, and you've got 6,000 holds to buy. It's a one almighty complex jigsaw puzzle. So I've employed somebody who's done this for many times with the climbing wall and just said, right, this is what we want to do. These are the sorts of climbers we have in the Highlands. The best kids are climbing V15 now. Somebody like Rhys Langlands is like becoming world class. So you think, okay, he needs somewhere to train. I would love to have people come through the gym and be really, really, really good rock climbers, but then to work out how that hold works and put it on the right angle, it's too complicated.
Well, if you go onto the Ledge Facebook page and probably other social medias, you can see that there's already a kind of VR type rendering of it and how it's going to be laid out, and it looks like a good space. There's a lot of interesting.
Space is big.
Yeah.
And I think, this is the difference between if you were building a national performance centre, it wouldn't work for the general climbing population, and it would be complete nonsense to think that you should build a climbing wall only good for the top level. It's cruel and pointless and
Yeah.
wasteful.
Yeah. Because there's still
So-
a lot of other climbers there that aren't anywhere near that level.
Well, the average climber in the Highlands, I'm sure, goes to the climbing wall and climbs 5 to 6B at most. So if you look at a bell curve of your market, and if you start breaking it down, and this is all from previous days working on these things for many people, you have to have an advert, and that's the big fancy bit. And then we have to have a performance bit, because that's our covenant with Mountaineering Scotland and Sport Scotland and Climb Scotland. But then you also think, well, I want everybody to come here and enjoy that. So when we're setting routes, we'll have 180 boulder problems in the building, which will recycle, I think, every 6 to 8 weeks. But absolutely 70% of those have to work for 70% of your customers. And it doesn't mean that you are ghettoizing people only to be on the vertical walls of the slab, but you need to buy the holds that somebody can climb a steep 5, but not just make it a ladder. So, that's the route setting is an absolute
Another
art.
challenge, yeah. So in terms of time scale, do you have a time scale at all at the moment?
There's now a time scale.
When
So
do you think you'll be opening the doors to the
So this
general
morning I
public?
gave the keys to the demolition company to strip out all the old bit of the furniture store. They'll be finished by the end of July. And then in the first week of August, our principal contractor comes in and they start building the showers and the toilets and the cafe and the retail space and all the lighting and all the walls. There's a physio going in, there's a gym, a yoga studio, a couple of offices, there's a party room. So when we have kids' parties on a Saturday and Sunday, there's a dedicated bouldering area with some autobeelies. It's sort of a clip and climb, but it's not a clip and climb. I would like to see more progression from that activity into climbing. So there's a big kids area. They need to go somewhere for a kids' party. And the same sort of thing as if you go to a trampoline park, 100 kids will go through every weekend. There'll be 2 who go, I want to go a little bit further. Our job is then to make sure that when they do want to do that, the pathways are easy. And we've got a place for the parents to come and sit and be comfortable while the kid's doing an ICAS, whatever level it's going to be. I cannot wait for that. I cannot wait.
I can tell. So I'll push you again for that. A date? Is there
Sorry.
date?
Yeah, I got distracted by the vision
Got very
again.
excited
I've been talking about
about
the vision for 7 years. And like the reality, it's coming fast.
Yeah.
So we just issued the contract now for the building work, and if we push them and there's no material shortages, we'll be open just before Christmas. If it slips, everything's going to slip a bit. Second week of January is probably a really realistic punt if we're going to push to try and be open before that. But then with a business hat on, you're employing everybody. Then they've got Christmas holidays. What do people do before Christmas? They go shopping. So if you look at any climbing wall, the best time to go is the 20th to the 24th because they're quiet. But then on Boxing Day, everybody's bored out of their wits and they want to go and do something. They want to work off that turkey. So if we could open between Christmas and New Year and have a really good opening New Year's party, that would be brilliant.
Any trips to France planned between now and
My
then?
own personal stuff.
Well, I'm just thinking every time you go to France, everything goes up in the air.
pear-shaped. Or it changes. Yeah. No, I'm going to go to Greece instead.
Okay, fair enough.
No, if we're looking for a December opening, I think I can see myself needing a rock refresher in October. Yeah, so I'll do a sun rock trip in October somewhere.
Okay. And any other sort of personal plans in terms of what you're going to do in the future if you get anything?
Well, for the 2 summers before the lockdown started, I did enduro motorcycle trips in Iceland.
Yes, I remember seeing it on social media.
Oh my God, they're brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I got really interested, and still am actually working with a Dutch motorcycle company called Revit, and I'm helping them design clothes that are much more like outdoor sports clothes rather than motorcycle clothes. So when I bought my first motorcycle in France, everything was just these big, heavy, square things that you couldn't move in. And then as soon as I rode a bike, I thought, it's really hard to get on and off the thing. If I need to repair a puncture, then I can't bend down. The stuff weighs a ton. And I started pestering a Scottish guy who works for Revit called Rod McIntyre. He's a snowboarder and a bit of a climber. His kids climb in Holland, and just started pestering him. I found him. So it was quite a typical thing, the way that I sort of started managing to get paid to wear climbing shoes and climbing ropes and then cairngorm rope stuff, is that I wrote to him and went, I've just worn this jacket and I think you could change this. And he wrote back and went, oh, that's interesting, because this is coinciding with us looking at how we can modify our clothing to make them more comfortable, lighter weight, and trend towards the outdoor sports market. And this is all linked to the development of electric off-road motorcycles as well. And then Rod and I have worked for the last 4 years on a range that was started to sell it last October, called the Dirt range. And that's a whole range of jacket, gloves, pants, in-boot pants, out-boot pants, protective clothing. And I've learned so much from them. It's a whole new thing. Because when I took up motorcycling really late on, and I'd forgotten what it was like to learn something with an element of risk that requires a great deal of skill, and to be an absolute, you know what it's like when you pick up a rope, you know what it smells like. You know what your shoes feel like when they go on your feet. You know all the sounds of your gear in and out of a rucksack. That's familiar to me, and that's a place of sort of comfort. And I love that. That's a really nice thing. But to do something really new and challenging and start something again and go, right, how do I do this? And then wanting to ride off-road. So in France, it was really easy. You could ride trials bikes in the ski resorts when there was no mountain bikers around. So I'd ride up the downhill tracks on a trials bike. And then I bought a slightly bigger one to do journeys. And this coincided with something called the Trans-European Trail. And it's a 35,000 kilometer off-road network of trails that runs through Poland, Latvia, Germany, Greece, Moldova. I mean, it's everywhere, all in Norway. And there's all these official off-road tracks that come underneath that umbrella. So with a bunch of mates in Saint-Gervais, we all bought Husqvarna kind of motocross bikes and rode lots and lots of this stuff. And then that coincided with me working with Rod at Revit. So I'm still doing that. I had a conversation with them this morning about developing a range of kit for electric motorbikes.
Okay. So just another
It's
finger in the
just,
pie, basically.
it's
just
interest.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's interest.
To keep
I mean, I don't make any money out of that at all. But I really love the process of having a discussion with somebody who can go, oh, that's a reasonable idea. Why don't we try that?
Yeah.
So
taking other learnings, like you mentioned earlier, and taking it to another industry, another thing.
And I think that has a benefit, because then you think about, when you wear a climbing harness, which one do you like and why? And why does that one not work? And why does that one work? And it's really interesting. I've now been using one of these Mammoth Smart Belay devices for the last 2 years. I've completely dumped any of the devices with cams and moving bits, and it's like a click-up type thing. It's a smart thing. I think, wow, they're great. It's such a natural way of using a rope and a safe way to belay. So I'm now having discussions with people like Al Halewood and Pete Hill about adopting a German regime for teaching how to belay with these kind of auto-blocking belay devices, how to teach dynamic belaying so that the catches are soft. That's all the stuff we want to be doing here. How do you take all of that cafe craft knowledge from Germany and build a training regime that works for 16-year-olds as well as 60-year-olds? Yeah. It's all learning, and it's very cool.
Well, we hope to see it in the Ledge.
You'll see it very soon.
Yeah. And when you open, I will make sure I'm up in there. So I'm looking forward to it.
And if you know any multimillionaires who want to save children from a bleak future, or
I'll keep my eye out.
Then well,
hopefully somebody will watch it.
I hope so.
Because they might know somebody, or that might be that person.
When there is cash out there to run the programs, but really, if I was 20 years younger, I would be thinking, right, I need to open a ledge in Newham in London. You know, with all the kind of learnings that we're having up here, introducing people to something that motivates them for life, and then can turn somebody from a pretty poor future into something that is motivated, even if it's creating community. There's so many places that could do with
I'm sure
visions like
what
that.
you're doing or what you plan to do with the ledge is very much transferable
Yeah, I hope so.
across the UK, and hopefully it does happen. Hopefully it happens.
I'm not quite at the age yet where I'm thinking about legacy, but that would be a nice one to think.
It would be. Well, we can catch up in the future and see where that's gone. But thank you for sitting down and talking to me.
I've actually really enjoyed it. It's been good fun.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it as well. It's been great. So I'll put some of the links to the ledge into the show notes. So if anybody is interested in donating or getting involved in any way, if you're a millionaire, that'd be awesome.
Or a carpenter.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Some Northwest based carpenters, that'd be great. But yeah, thanks a lot. It's been great, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.